a friend of mine said, "Oh, you did theater when you were, when you were in high school. Why don't you direct a play?" And I was like, "You can't just go and direct a play." Turns out you kind of can. And so I went to a theater that was just starting a venue. It's a very nice venue that had just opened in Caracas. And I called the artistic director and said, "Hey, I want to direct a play." And it's kind of not the same model in the US as a regional theater. But here, the theater really is just a venue, and you kind of have to produce your own play. You have to, the theater just stays with a percentage of actually pretty closer to what the Broadway model is. But so I went ahead and I called one of my best friends who was kind of a natural producer. He did all this camp counseling and organized, summer camps, and he had that quality. I said, "Listen, you want to help me produce a play?" And we produced a Woody Allen play called "Play It Again, Sam," and I translated it myself, and I directed it, and I cast, and he did very well. And so I directed another one and another one, and so the company actually kept growing, and then we veered into doing musicals, and so I translated and I directed, I co-translated and directed Fiddler on the Roof, then Jesus Christ Superstar, then The Producers. Mel Brooks sent me a very nice letter that I cherish somewhere in my hard drive. And this small company actually became a very, very large theater company in Venezuela. And we also did world premiere plays. There's a very famous Venezuelan playwright named Isaac Chocron, and he kind of took me under his wing, and I directed the final play that he wrote before he passed. And also we brought in Moises Kaufman, and we did Gross Indecency, The Three Trials of Oscar Wilde. So I spent, all in all, I would say, 7 to 8 years in Venezuela producing theater with the company Palo de Agua, my company, until things got complicated with the Venezuelan government, and we faced, significant difficulties. I think the first one was when we were doing our second or third season of Fiddler on the Roof. We were, it was a year 2009. It was just from 2008 to 2009. That winter, there was a big conflict between Gaza and Israel, and Hugo Chavez, a Venezuelan dictator / president, expelled the Israeli ambassador. And by the way, to this day, there is no Israeli ambassador in Venezuela. And there certainly was this feeling that it was, it was a precarious feeling for the Jewish community, for sure. And for the government institutions, the orchestra, Gran Mariscal de Ayacucho, which was the orchestra that we used to work with, we would hire them, but that's an orchestra that typically is subsidized by the Venezuelan government. So they suddenly, the director of the orchestra called me 10 days before we were supposed to open the show and said, "We cannot be part of a Jewish show. You have to understand. We get our subsidy, we get our money from the government. And after what happened with Israel, we can't be seen with you. I'm sure you understand." And I was in shock. I was in shock of receiving that phone call. I grew up in a Venezuelan Jewish community that never saw themselves as victims or as, we were just a vibrant part of the community. My own father was, he was the Secretary of Economy at a previous government. in the early 90s for a few years, the president of the central bank was, I mean, it was a very integral, this was not a, and then suddenly, that phone call was a big wake-up call. We went to the press with that story, and we were able to form an orchestra just by mainly calling most of those musicians who have already learned the show to come and play it under, under a different orchestra name. And it was actually very beautiful what happened in the theater, which was, in Venezuela, it has more of a operatic tradition. So the audience would sit. This is a very big venue where we used to perform at, 2,600 people or so. And the orchestra would enter. It would be like an entrance of the orchestra, like they do in operas. And when that happened, the first time it happened, the entire audience stood up to give the orchestra a standing ovation. And it, I remember just tears coming out of my eyes, and I get chills every time I tell that story. It became, going to the theater became, to see our show, to see Fiddler on the Roof, right, out of it, became an act of political defiance. And the opposition was so, at that time, so organized and so full of life that we sold out the entire run. We sold out the entire run because also we were brave enough to go to the press and explain what happened. And then something similar happened to us a few years or the following year. We were doing yet again, Jesus Christ Superstar. And we were, the makers of BlackBerry was very big in Venezuela at that time. They wanted to be our sponsors because the BlackBerry storm was coming out. But the way the law works in Venezuela, you cannot, the phone brands cannot give us directly money. They have to do it through one of the phone services. So they wanted to do it with the one that the government owned. And we were very concerned. We went to the first meeting and the guy said, listen, you don't need to worry. Like, we're smart people. We want your audience. Relax. Like, this is not going to be an issue. And it wasn't an issue until I think like a Tuesday, 10 days before, they fired that person. They fired half of the staff of the phone company, and they called us to a meeting and they said, by the way, RIM, this was RIM's money. This was not the money from Movilnet. This was RIM, the BlackBerry, makers of BlackBerry, RIM. It was going to be $150,000 in cash and $150,000 in media buys, which for us in Venezuela at that moment was all the money in the world, absolutely all the money in the world. And they called us to a meeting and they said, listen, there's no reason why this contract shouldn't go ahead. However, we do ask of you to sign this agreement saying you're not going to advertise with your own money or the money RIM gives you in the following outlets. And it included all the important, newspapers and all the important radios. And it just kind of left the government ones untouched and a few other, shady. And, it was complicated for us because we had not raised any other money with other sponsors because we were working on this deal for a few months. So if we say no to this agreement, it would put us in a precarious economic situation that would put the whole thing very close to bankruptcy. But if we say yes, then we would be morally bankrupt. And that, we felt, it was the worst of all, choices. So we wrote them a letter saying that what they're asking from us violates our rights, violates what democracy is based on. And we sent it to them, and we CC'd every single newspaper in the country. And that gave us a little, people came again, like the same dynamic. They came to the theater as an act of defiance. It was, and then in the middle of the run, at the beginning of the second act, in I think the second week or so, we were attacked by tear gas. It's the day I'll remember for the rest of my life. It was a Sunday in February in 2010. And I was watching the show when we heard, I was all the way at the back of the house when we heard from the intercom that there was something that looked like tear gas backstage. And I had, at that moment, I had broken my ligament, my knee ligament, and I had a hard time walking, but I ran, and I was getting close to backstage, and I opened a door, and I got in, and the gas just took me to the floor in a way that, listen, I've marched, I have taken a lot of tear gas in my life by just, by being part of the opposition. But all that gas happened outdoors. This was the first time that I was encountered with tear gas indoors. And it was so heavy. And by that time, I couldn't see the gas. It's not like that classical cloud that you typically, that I saw many times. The cloud had gone already, but everything was still there in the air. And I fell down, and I rushed backstage. And we always had firefighters then, because it's almost 3,000 people in the house, so there was always and they had with them 5 gas masks, and this was a cast of 27. So the lead fireman said to me, "Show must go on. If we try to to have the audience member leave the house, it can be tragic, because they'll be rushing as they evacuate, and show must go on." And the orchestra pit was on the lower floor of the stage, which was where the tear gas had happened, and there was no way to communicate with the orchestra, and they kept on playing, but they were slowly losing musicians. And the actors, they said, they kind of sealed off backstage, and they said, well, after you leave stage, just go behind the set. And then they had this 5 masks that they would breathe, share it, and then continue to perform. It was miraculous that they could finish it. And the musicians, we had 40 musicians. It's a big, our productions were big. And I think 6 or 7 musicians finished the performance. And after that, I remember the first thing I did as I was running, it was my wife, we had married recently, and my mother, both were in the house, and I approached them and I said, leave. I wanted them, I didn't know what was out there. I said, get out of here. And that reaction from me was a reaction from the audience after they found out, that we had been tear gas, is that it's dangerous to go to a theater. And that took a toll on our box office the following week, and we never recovered from that. I think at that moment, it was clear to me that the writing was on the wall, in as much as it's exciting to be a dissident artist. And the work we had, we really were perceived as such, but I couldn't, I just got married, I wanted to start a family. I could not justify staying in Venezuela, after that.